In this video, we're going to be looking at sampling techniques and bias. What is sampling? When gathering data of a large group, which is termed as a population, it is not always feasible to study each member directly. Selecting a subset of a group to survey is known as sampling. A good sample is representative of the whole population and unbiased. Let's look at what bias and variability both mean. Bias are the characteristics of a sampling method that decrease accuracy. And variability is the characteristics of a sampling method that decrease precision, so the data is less reliable. Let's look at what both of those might mean together. So, when a sample has high variability but low bias, that means that the responses are more accurate, but they're just all over the place, and we can't really rely on that type of data. When the responses have low variability and high bias, that means that our data is reliable, but it's not accurate, so that doesn't really help us either. What we want to have in our samples is low variability and low bias. So, for this, we can use random samples to reduce bias, and use larger samples to reduce variability. That's how we can get an optimal sample. Now, there are many sampling techniques out there, but in AP Statistics, these are going to be the 5 main sampling methods that are tested on the exam, and we're going to talk about each of these in turn. First, let's look at the simple random sample, often abbreviated as SRS. In this sampling technique, every participant has the same chance of being picked for the sample. Let's take a look at the general process to conduct an SRS. First, we assign each participant in the population a random number. We use a random digits table or a calculator function to generate random numbers enough times until the desired sample size is reached. The numbers chosen correspond to the participants chosen to be in the sample. Now, that might be a lot to take in with just a verbal description, so let's look at this with an example. So, with a population of 15 people, we're going to conduct an SRS of 5 people, and that means that we want our sample size to be 5. So first, everyone in the population is randomly assigned a number from 1 to 15, and we include this digit of 0 here as a placeholder in order to more effectively use our random digit table. Our next step is to use this random digit table to choose 5 people, our sample size, ignoring repeats. So let's look at how we choose someone. So first, we look at 27. Is that a number anyone had? No. Then we look at 79. Is that a number anyone had? Also no. And the reason why we're looking at this in like 2-digit batches is because our maximum number of digits that anyone assigned was 2 digits, because 15 is a 2-digit number. Anyway, back to this. So now is 81. And anyone have that? No, nobody had that. So we keep doing this, and then we find that 11. Oh, well, somebody was assigned 11. So now that person is chosen to be in the sample. And then we keep doing this over and over until we get 5 people chosen. Now, what if 11 popped up somewhere else over here? What if over here, we get 11? We don't choose that person twice. We just ignore repeats. The numbers chosen correspond to those chosen for the survey. Now, let's look at a systematic random sample. This is a sampling method based on a pattern where every nth person is chosen. So for example, when we have a population of 12 people, we choose every 3rd person. So that's what's happening over here. So what we do is we pick a random starting point, like, let's say that, this was our starting point. The starting point should be random. That's how we do this in a random fashion. So this is our random starting point. 1, 2, 3. Oh, we pick that person. And then we go 1, 2, 3. Now we pick that person. That's how the sampling method works. Next, we're going to look at a stratified random sample. So here the population is divided into subgroups based on a trait that they share. And this subgroup is called strata. So then we randomly select n number of people from each strata, or we randomly select n% of people from each strata. And those are the people that are in the sample. So textbooks, they tend to call this thing taking an SRS of each strata, which kind of makes sense. You have this little group, and then you're like, oh, I'm going to choose 5 people from each group, and we do that randomly, just how we saw with that random digit table earlier. That's what we're basically doing here. And this is often going to be contrasted with a cluster sample. A cluster sample is where the population is divided into subgroups based on a trait that they share, and they're called clusters. And in Stratified, it was called strata. Here, it's called clusters. And then we just randomly choose one or more of the clusters. So I think that this graphic here does a great job of describing the difference between the two. Now, with cluster sampling here, we're just like literally entirely choosing clusters to be sampled. We're not actually going in and like individually taking an SRS. That's not happening. We're just entirely choosing clusters to be a part of the sample. And a question that might come up on the exam is, how is a cluster sample more biased? Well, it is biased because we are missing out on some groups entirely, so it might not be representative of the entire population. Now, a multi-stage sample, which isn't really tested on the AP exam in a lot of detail, but just a vocabulary word that you need to know, is that it is combining multiple sampling techniques that usually occurs for large populations. Now, let's look at the types of bias that could occur when conducting a survey. So here, under coverage, certain groups are underrepresented in the population. This is what we were talking about, the cluster sample. You can miss out on some groups entirely. Next, we have voluntary response. So when sample members are self-selected volunteers, that is a type of bias because they're choosing to participate. Next, we have non-response. So when a large portion of those sampled fail to respond. So let's say we do an SRS and like most of those people, they just don't respond. Then that's not good. That's a type of bias. So then here we have response bias. So respondents are led to answer in a certain way. So for example, a police officer asks how many people in the sample drive under a certain speed limit. Things like that, leading questions and lying, just a systematic pattern of incorrect answers. Like you're pretty sure most people are going to say they drive under the speed limit. That's a type of bias. Now, let's look at some bad sampling techniques that really do have a greater concentration of these types of bias. First, we have convenience sampling. So that is when you select individuals in the sample who are easy to reach. So an example for this is you just choose the first 6 people that enter the room to sample. That has an undercoverage bias because it's not going to be representative of the entire population. Next, we have voluntary response sampling. So individuals in the sample can choose whether or not they want to respond. So first of all, that's under coverage because you're missing out on those people who chose not to respond. Then it's also going to be voluntary response bias because they're choosing. And then also in this type of sampling, you could see other things. You could also see non-response. Maybe they say they're going to respond and then they don't. There's just a lot of bias that could be introduced with these bad sampling techniques that you want to avoid. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching and good luck studying.